Okay, I think I'll just kick off. Hopefully you can see my screen okay. You can let me know if you can't see my screen. Otherwise, I'm going to assume that you can. Thank you for joining Grand Rounds this afternoon. I had got in touch with Tom a few months ago and said, I've done some stuff for my master's. I think it would be good if I got the opportunity to present it at Grand Rounds, and I got this slot. It's probably quite a quiet slot today. I think a lot of people are maybe off in the sunshine somewhere. But I'm hopefully just going to take a little bit of your time to talk through some of the things that I explored as part of my master's project and also in my role as staff development lead in NHS Tayside and the School of Medicine in Dundee. My name is Jordan Napier. I spend most of my time at work speaking to medical educators, talking to them about their role as clinicians and educators at the same time and helping them navigate those two different aspects of their roles and identity, which is where this topic of research came in. I worked alongside Dr. Mandy Moffat, who's a senior lecturer in the Centre for Medical Education on this project. And it was really, really interesting and hopefully has some relevance or sparks a bit of interest for you today as well. Let me just move on. So the way that I wanted to envisage this project was looking at telling a story. So the way that I'm going to frame it is, where is the story set? What is the backdrop and who are the main characters? What genre did we use to tell the story? What were the different themes and motifs that came forward? How does the plot develop and what is the next story in this series? And I suppose this lends itself quite nicely to my background is non-clinical. I came from studying literary studies at university into exploring healthcare improvement and quality improvement. So it kind of goes back to the stuff that I find really interesting, which is a little bit about how we use words. And I'm just always bowled over by the way that people use words in quite a creative way to express their experiences as learners and teachers. So the setting for this study was NHS Tayside, Ninewells Hospital mainly, specifically. The backdrop was that this is a busy teaching hospital, that most of the people involved in teaching on our MBCHB programme are also busy clinicians. And the main characters as part of this story are the medical educators, so the doctors who do a bit of teaching as well, ranging from maybe doctors who have some sessions within their job plans specifically for teaching, to people who are still in training programs. So they are trainee doctors, but they're also contributing to teaching and learning of our students as well. So that's the setting, the backdrop and the characters. And what we really wanted to explore was expression of identity and that kind of educator identity. You could probably go on for days talking about all the different definitions of identity, but for the purposes of this talk today, we're thinking about identity as perceptions of self and how that is represented to others, and the way that individuals understand themselves, interpret what's going on around them, and present themselves and wish to be perceived in that way. So that is, that's how we're defining identity. It's really interesting when you look at some of the literature around medical educator identity, because it talks a lot about disconnects between the role of the physician and the role of the teacher. You might have a role as a teaching lead or as a clinical supervisor, but it doesn't sort of fluidly go from your clinical role to your teaching role. There's a bit of a disconnect. There can be a bit of tension between the two roles and identities. It can be a bit of a juggling act. And usually people will describe their teaching identity as secondary to their main role, which is usually their clinical role and patient-facing role. So this really interests me that we have this tension and this disconnect. In my role as staff development lead, where I'm trying to help support people in their teaching role, I often see this disconnect and juggling act played out in practice. So I've mentioned that I've got a really interest in language and words and how we use them to express ourselves. And what's fascinating is identity is really rooted in language. It's about how we use language and words to express that, to help other people understand our identity, how our identity is developing, how our identity might be different from someone else's. So looking at language was a really important part of this. And then from language, we made that kind of leap to thinking about metaphor. So I've always been fascinated by how people choose which metaphors they use to describe experiences. And really, when you look at the literature, there's a lot that suggests that humans really think in metaphors. We look for similarities between different concepts. And particularly in medicine, this is huge. And if you look at even some of the kind of wording that you might use when explaining a new concept in medicine to a student, a lot of the time you will probably end up using that figurative and metaphorical language in order to do that. This is quite a nice, fairly recent paper that's an editorial piece that describes some of those really well used and well-known metaphors in medicine. So we've got examples here of how doctors use metaphors to explain things to patients. So we've got burning pain, cluster headache, glue ear, whiplash injury, and one of my favorite ones to explore is the use of slightly military metaphor sometimes when talking about cancer. So we'll have invasive, we'll have battle used quite a bit. And even if we think about the COVID-19 pandemic, we spoke about a war on COVID-19. We used a lot of military metaphors, and it's just to help people make sense and instill a sort of feeling about the topic, as well as describe the content of something. So metaphors in medicine are huge, which is why I then made the leap to wanting to explore which metaphors, similes, or other forms of imagery do medical educators use to express their identity as medical educator. And further on from that, what might these expressions tell us about the participants' connection to, attitude to, and views of identifying as a medical educator? So this was my kind of desire to explore some of that disconnect or the juggling or the tension. So when we have someone using quite military or war-based metaphor about their role, what does that tell us about their attitude towards that? In order to maybe find out a little bit more about how we can bring in appropriate support for people in these roles. So those were my research questions, and I think it's worthwhile at this point saying that I am not a researcher. That's not what I identify as. I am mainly an educator and a facilitator of learning. So this was quite a new experience for me to start identifying as a researcher, and quite uncomfortable. And I would say I'm definitely more a teacher than a researcher. But I had to get right stuck into thinking about the medical education research theory and how I would frame this. So we used constructivist grounded theory as our sort of stance on this. I hosted 2 workshops with 17 participants, all from NHS Tayside, all medical educators. And the workshop involved facilitated discussion as some of it, but most of the time spent using coaching cards to facilitate discussion. This is my trusty pack of coaching cards. It's just a series of different photographs. The photographs range from pictures of people's faces to scenes of beautiful scenery in the countryside. There might be pictures of machinery, pictures of different animals, scenes from nature. They're really quite varied. And I'd used these coaching cards in my practice as a teacher just to sometimes generate conversation, and found that they really helped people think creatively and use words in a creative way, which is why we built that into this bit of research. And I asked participants to pick an image that represents your identity as an educator, and asked, why did you pick that image, and got them to explore that a little bit more. And obviously, as part of the research, those explanations were transcribed. That language that they used was all collected as data and themed. Just a note, if anyone does ever want to borrow my pack of coaching cards, they do live in my office in Nine Wells, and you're very welcome to do that. They were a really, really nice tool for starting the conversation. So once I'd had those conversations with people and used the coaching cards in that way, we started to theme them and think about what are the main motifs or imagery that are coming out of the stories that people are telling about their medical educator identity. And this is just a little selection of some of the images that people chose to represent their identity as a medical educator. So you should be able to see there, we've got some scenes of nature. We've got some tomatoes there and some daffodils. We've got an orchestral conductor and an athlete at the start of a race. We've got a Formula One pit stop crew, an eagle. There's a motorcycle there, a sort of tunnel with rubble on a path, and we've got a skydiver as well. And this is quite a nice representation of the different cards that people selected, and then how they used that card to tell a story about their identity as an educator. This is a lovely one. This was a participant that had chosen those tomatoes on the vine. So this one here with the red and green tomatoes, and they'd said, we get them when they're all green and fresh, and we sort of nurture them through so that they're at the stage when they are ready. So this person really saw themselves as a gardener with a tomato plant, and it was their job to tend to that plant to help the tomatoes go from green to red. They used a lot of terminology around nurturing and growth, and that was one of the ways that someone had depicted and used imagery for their medical educator identity. Another one here, so this is a participant that had selected that image of the athlete at the start of the run. I guess the students in the starting blocks with that long road and the hurdles ahead, and really my job is to try and get them out of the starting blocks as best as possible, not just in terms of the specialist learning, but also just being a doctor. So they were seeing their students as being that athlete with the hurdles in front of them, and they were the coach, and it was their job to get them out of the starting blocks as best as possible. But they spoke about their identity as an educator not just being about teaching students and trainees about content and helping them develop knowledge, but also helping them more holistically be a doctor. And they linked that to an athletic coach, which I thought was quite nice. This participant chose an image of a motorcycle with a sidecar. And they said, I've got a sidecar for like my registrar or my students or whatever, and they can come with me if they want to. It could be cool. They could learn loads of opportunities, sort of their space, but whether or not they take it is slightly up to them. So they identified as the driver of the motorcycle with the space, saying, I'm giving the space to my learner if they want to take it. But really they spoke about that their role wasn't to force people to take those opportunities. It was just to let them know the space was there. And this person spoke a lot about just how a lot of their role as a teacher was just having students and trainees alongside them, observing them in practice, having conversations about patient cases. So really they used the imagery of the sidecar. This is a diagram of the different metaphors and how we themed them as part of this research. So some people identifying as gardeners and farmers. We've got skydivers and motorcyclists, athletes, travelers, people saying that they're on a journey in a tunnel, entertaining, conducting orchestras, enthusing people. So we identified a few themes. A lot of people spoke about their identity being linked to movement in some way, whether it was that they were moving or they were helping their students and trainees move through a process, and whether that is movement through growth like gardening and farming, or movement as a race like the athlete or the F1 pit stop team or the skydiver, and also movement as navigation, so helping people, being the compass for people navigating the different curricula or their learning journey in some way. There was lots of metaphors of environment used, so people describing that their identity didn't exist as an educator on its own, and it was about the environment that they worked in. So things like the racing track, everything being very fast-paced, navigating through a path that had a lot of rubble on it. So they spoke about the kind of barriers and difficulties that they'd come across, the hurdles, the garden, the farm, the winding road. So there was lots of people using metaphors to describe the environment that they were working in. And most of the participants were involved in teaching in the clinical environment rather than in a classroom-based environment. So that made a lot of sense, that a lot of the time the hurdles or the rubble that they were describing was just the workload in the clinical environment that they had to help students and trainees navigate. So the main sort of take homes from these stories that people shared using the cards was the environment is having a huge impact on how medical educators identify and how they work. Lots of talk about rushing, fast-paced and short bursts, which I'm sure is not surprising to most people that are listening. There was a lot of talk about the medical educator identity being about someone that manages risk and uncertainty. There was talk about the role of the medical educator as being entertainment for learners. This came up a lot, that people would say, I know that I'm in the clinical environment and I'm meant to do X, Y, and Z, but I'm aware I've got to entertain the students as well, or I've got to provide some entertainment for them. So there was this idea of being the sort of jester and having to engage their attention. There was a theme that came out of people feeling quite alone in their educator identity, whereas in their clinical identity, they talked a lot more about team-based learning and working as part of a team. So there was definitely this sense that sometimes when people are involved in teaching, they do it much more as a solitary activity and they see it as being something they do on their own, which I found really interesting. And I suppose finally, one of the things that came out of the themes was just the role of maybe faculty development and what I do in my role within the medical school is helping people talk a little bit about their identity, how they navigate that, because just the talking about it was a development activity in itself. People got the opportunity to ask questions of each other, to share some of their challenges, and probably got to get a little bit off their chest, which is always helpful. These were the main lessons that we took from this research. I think overall I was really struck by how important environment is to where someone is working as an educator. So how we best support medical educators to work in the environment that they are in and to help them develop the teaching in that way, rather than designing processes for classroom-based teaching that don't fit in the clinical environment. The second lesson was about, let's just start talking about how we identify as medical educators. And what metaphors do we use for that, and what does that tell us about our attitude towards it? So you might say, well, I feel like I am I'm the pit stop, the Formula One pit stop team. Everything's so fast paced. Why is that? Why do we feel like that? And how does that kind of the design of the curriculum impact on that? And thirdly, something really interesting that came up was that I think there was about potentially 5 participants in the workshops who were doctors in training, as well as people who are involved in teaching, and they were able to give a really nice sort of slightly different view on things, because they're going through a learning journey as well as teaching. And so they had a really nice, unique perspective on what it's like to navigate a medical education journey as a learner, but also be a teacher. So I think it was really, I found speaking to them really valuable for kind of thinking about how we do things better. The main message for me, I think, was don't expect your skydiver to need the same tools as your gardener. So the people that were identifying as the nurturing gardener in the farm, they don't need the same support and staff development as the person who describes their role as being, I'm a skydiver jumping out of a plane with my trainee and I've just got to keep them safe. So we probably learned quite a lot about being staff-centered as part of this research, which is always a really nice message to reiterate. Since the initial workshops that we've done as part of the research, we've just offered this up as a workshop for staff to attend as a CPD session, and it's really been fascinating and is evaluated really well. We've done it with staff locally, and we've also taken it into an international conference setting as well. We have another workshop coming up on the 23rd of August in 9 Wells. It's in person, it's an hour and a half. you get to get lots of things off your chest. Maybe you get to kind of reflect a little bit on your role and think about where you want to go next with it or what you want to let go of. So I would encourage you to come along to that if you would like. This is the QR code for how you could sign up to the workshop. These will keep happening continuously. So if you don't manage to come along to the next one, just keep an eye out on the booking page, because likelihood is we'll have another one again. If you work in a team and you would like myself and or Mandy to come along and do this session in a team with you, we're more than welcome to be contacted about that as well. If you want to read more about this project, there was a paper published on this work in MedEd Publish, so you can scan the QR code here and read a little bit more about it. As I said, I'm not a researcher, so framing it in a research way was quite challenging for me. I found that I probably used most of the learning in my role as an educator and teacher. But if you want a little bit of light reading on medical educator identities, then this is the paper for you. I'm going to stick up some references there. I'm very aware that Tom isn't here, but I am happy to take any questions if anyone has any. Thank you very much for listening. And if anyone wants to get in touch about any of this, please feel free to contact me. My email is jjnapier@dundee.ac.uk. I will stop sharing my slides now. And I'll just pause in case anyone wants to ask a question.
Can I just come in, Jordan? Sorry, I'm not sure how to put, I'm so used to Teams calls, I'm not sure how to put my hand up.
Hello, yeah, on you go.
Hi, sorry, I'm Sophie. I work within the nursing and midwifery education department. Would you, a really great session, thank you so much. I really liked how you formatted it, how you sort of laid it out in this sort of storytelling way. That was really interesting. Is your, maybe I missed it, but what was your general age group or demographic of, mainly ages, of the educators that you're, medical educators that you've been looking at and working with?
In terms of this research?
Yes.
There was, I do have the exact figures, but roughly there was about half of the participants have been working and teaching from 10 to 15 years, and half of them were probably under 10 years. There was a group of trainees and a group of people who were consultants and specialty doctors that were slightly more experienced.
Okay, thank you. My next question was with the workshop that you mentioned at the end, is that open to all educators, including nurses and midwives? Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone at all. I think it probably lends itself well to healthcare professions in general, but yeah, welcome. Anyone's welcome.
Thank you so much. That's all. That was really helpful.
Thank you.
Again, I can't work out how to put my hand up, Jordan. Gosh, one gets so used to one piece of software. Which do you see yourself as, and do you think that has changed over the years in your current, in your work within the university?
Yeah, I think every time I think about this, it changes slightly. I think recently I've been thinking about, I'm a spider that weaves a web. I think I weave a web and then I help people connect the webs. So maybe I'm catching flies in my web, because I suppose part of my role is to help make sure that I get people and then I can support them when they need it. So sometimes you're just wanting to cast your web as far as possible, but I don't always get the web in the right place at the right time.
At that point, a spider did actually crawl across my screen. That was extraordinary. I tried to catch it, but it sort of ran off. Yeah. No, I think it's really interesting, the use of metaphors. I think it's really interesting also the metaphor of the environment we are in. I did a talk last week to another school and indeed to another university using the metaphor of a snakes and ladders board, one for scholarship and one for the sense of belonging. and I thought, oh yeah, actually having drawn out the snakes and ladders board because I wanted to use a picture that wasn't copyright and I couldn't find one, I thought, oh, I just have to draw it out myself. Of course, I thought, having used it once, I'll use it for something else. But I think it is important, this hook, that, you know, this really pulls people in, and you know, sometimes they feel a bit bamboozled with all the theory. I don't know why I said they, I can say we sometimes feel bamboozled by all the theory, and actually making those metaphors does indeed sort of bring it alive for us. Thank you very much, really interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, I definitely find I use a lot of metaphors in my training for staff. So I use baking metaphors a lot about, like, well, what ingredients do you need in order to make this cake work? Or use metaphors around like swimming, like how do you keep afloat? And so there's a lot of it, but medicine is really interesting. A lot of anatomy teaching, people use metaphors to describe the sort of consistency of different parts of the body and what it looks like. There's lots of food metaphors used in anatomy, which is fairly disgusting but also really interesting.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Are there sort of, I mean, I use driving a car. God, that's really boring, isn't it? I think cooking's far more interesting.
Any other questions? Grand. Okay, well, hopefully some of you can come along to the next workshop that we are doing. It's been really fun delivering these. I always learn something new each time, and I feel like I'm collecting people's metaphors. I'll pop a link into the chat box of the main booking page, and if you just have a look at August, you'll see that the workshop is in there. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.